In this video I'll demonstrate how to build an ASP.NET application using Visual Studio.NET and C#. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you to read the lesson text for Lesson 22. It'll contain a lot of introductory material and concepts that I'll refer to during the course of this walkthrough. Now, assuming that you've already read the lesson, you're ready to get started, let's begin by creating a new project. I'm going to go to File, New, Project, select Visual C# Projects, and this time I want to select an ASP.NET Web application. Now notice that you can't name the project from the name line. However, what you can do is change the name after the word localhost. So in this case I'm going to call this Lesson 22 and click OK. And it'll take just a moment or so to set up all the things that we're going to review in just a moment and see what Visual Studio.NET actually did. The first thing that Visual Studio.NET does is place a folder called Lesson 22 in your Documents and Settings, My Documents, Visual Studio Projects, and then under that it'll create a folder, the name of the project that you created, in this case Lesson 22, with a .sln, which is our solution file, and some other files that are usually hidden, but I'm displaying all of them, that also contain some solution information. Now this solution will basically point to an area on my hard drive where all Internet Information Service applications are stored and run from by default, and that is my iNet pub directory. So I'm going to go to my computer, go to my local hard drive, and look for the iNet pub directory, and then I'm going to look for the subdirectory called www.root, and as you can see here I have Lesson 22, and it contains all the files that we see right here in our project. So that's where things are located once Visual Studio.NET completes setting up your project for you. Additionally, Visual Studio.NET will set up your project in Internet Information Services so that it can be run in a browser from your local web server. So I'm going to drill down till I find my Lesson 22. You can see that it's defined as a project, and you can see all the files that are inside that project. I can right-click and look at the properties and view all the properties for my Lesson 22 application that I wrote. Now let's take a minute and review all the files that were created by default for me whenever I created a new web form application. Before I do that, just remember that if you need to delete your web application for some reason, there's three places that you need to go. The first thing you should do is remove it from Internet Information Services, then remove it from your Visual Studio Projects folder in My Documents, and then finally from your iNet pub www.root directory. And you may even have to reboot your computer before you do that, before you access that folder. So just be forewarned, if you ever need to do that, that's how you'd go about it. Now, of all the files that are created for you automatically, you'll have just one web page to start off with, webform1.aspx. The first thing that I like to do is rename this file, because whenever I'm running a website, typically the first page that will be used is default.aspx. This means that if I were to type in, for example, www.learnvisualstudio.net, what page comes up? Well, Internet Information Services is mapped to load the default.aspx page first. Sometimes people use index.aspx or index.htm or default.htm, whatever you choose to do, but typically I like to rename the webform1.aspx to default.aspx. Now there's quite a bit of other files that are available here, and we'll talk about these at length in the 3000 series on LearnVisualStudio.net. So be sure to review that so that you can learn more about how ASP.NET works and how you can gain more control over your applications. We're going to create a very, very simple example for the purpose of this lesson. But the first file that we'll just briefly talk about is the global.asax file, and this contains settings for your entire project, and it runs every time a request is made to your project. So, for example, every time that a request is made or the application is run for the first time, then you have an event that you can handle. Every time a new session or a new user starts using your application, there's an event that we can handle. And every time a request is made of your application, so a page request like default.aspx is made, you can handle that event as well outside of the context of that page. Also, whenever the request has finished or whenever an exception happens, we can handle those. When the session is over or when the application comes to an end, we have the ability to write code for those events in the lifetime of our web application. We also have a web config file created by default, and the web config will contain other settings that are global to our entire project. Like we can set the security for our website, define custom information like data access information. Sometimes people put connection strings to their database here. Also, we can configure debugging as well. So there's a lot of information here that we can set and enable tracing or debugging within our web application and so on. But we would do it from here. Again, I'm just going to refer you to the 3000 series to get a more in-depth look at how the web config and the global ASAX, plus all of the objects that are available to you in ASP.NET Web Forms. But the majority of our focus for this video is going to be on our default.aspx, our web form, the actual file that will get displayed onto the user's internet browser as they're surfing to our website. Now in the lesson text I talk quite a bit about the concept of code behind. And so what I want to do here is to show you visually what a code behind will look like in the Solution Explorer. And to do that, I'm going to select this button here on our Solution Explorer called Show All Files. And when I do, notice that it puts a little plus sign next to the default.aspx. If I expand that out, you'll see that we have a new file that becomes visible, default.aspx.cs. So if I were to double-click to open that file, you'll notice that this is just a simple code view. It'll look very similar to the WinForms that we've been creating for the previous 21 lessons of this series. This structure of having an ASPX file and a .aspx.cs file allows us to gain all the benefits from using HTML-like syntax in our presentation layer while having all the convenience of programming in a WinForms environment. So let's do something fun here just to get started, and I'm going to drag and drop a text box onto the designer surface. And when I do, let's take a look at what happens in the code behind. Notice that it creates a reference to that text box so that we can programmatically control that text box from our code. But the question is, how does ASP.NET know to link this file to this file? And the way that it does it is through an instruction called a directive. So if you're on this designer view and you look at the bottom here, you can see you have a design surface view and an HTML view. Let's look at the HTML view, which gives us kind of the HTML code for that web page. You'll notice first of all that we have this page directive at the top. The purpose of it, the main purpose, is to make some global settings for that entire web page. One of the most important settings is the code behind setting, where it defines that it's code behind that file that will define all of the interactive code for this web page is found in default.aspx.cs. So there's that link that ties those two files together. And there's some other information here as well, and we're not going to take the time to look at all those. Again, I refer you to the ASP.NET series for a complete discussion of all these ideas. But also I want you to take a look here where we've added this text box to our design surface. We see HTML-like code. This is not pure HTML, but it'll be interpreted by the ASP.NET runtime, and it'll be converted into HTML that's appropriate for the version of browser that your user is currently using to take care of all the nuances of that particular browser. So we see some information that is defined for this text box. Again, knowing that this will be turned into an actual input HTML tag whenever it is viewed by the web browser. But what is important is that we can write code that will impact what happens in our web page. So, for example, let's do this. Textbox1.text equals hello world. And now let's run our application. And you can see that I have a single text box with the word hello world in it. So you can see programmatically I can manipulate properties of the objects that are sitting on my web page via my code behind. So really this is a lot like developing WinForm applications. You can drag things onto a designer surface and then reference their properties in code. Let's go ahead and have a little more fun here and drag and drop a button onto our designer surface and show some more interactivity. So I'm going to double click the button, which will give me my button 1 click event. And here when somebody clicks on our button, we want to change the text that's visible in our text box. So I'm going to put hi there. Okay. Now let me for the moment just comment this out, or else this will not work, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But I'll show you how we can respond to events via what's called a post back. So here we have an empty text box. I'll click, and did you notice a little green bar appeared? And then you saw hi there. What happened is that the entire page was essentially reloaded. So when we click this button, it sent the page with the new value back to the web server. The web server interpreted the request, which in this case was simply a button click, decided that it needed to set a new value as a result of the code that we wrote in the button 1 click event, and then returned the web page to us. Now it just looked like it happened automatically. There's nothing really changed with the web page. It just looked like we were actually dealing with a WinForm. That's how responsive it was. But really what happened behind the scenes is that there was an entire request of that page back to the web server and then back to your user's web browser. Let's go ahead and shut this down. Now I want to demonstrate the possible problems that can happen whenever you're dealing with postback. The potential problem is that since you have multiple events firing, you could run into situations where it doesn't seem like your code is performing correctly. So let me demonstrate exactly how that would happen. Let's go ahead and first of all go here and add another text box onto our designer surface, and I'm going to add a label and resize it. And what I want to do this time is allow the user to type in their first name and their last name. I'm going to click the button and then have the first name and last name concatenated together and placed in this label control. So let's go here. I'm going to paste in some code. So when the form loads or the page loads, we're going to, by default, put an enter first name, enter last name, and then clear out the label text. And whenever somebody clicks the button, then what we want to do is take the first name and the last name that they type in, concatenate them together, and put them in the label. So I'm just going to paste some code in that does exactly that. So we have label1.text equals textbox1.text plus a space plus textbox2.text. Let's go ahead and save that. Now let's run our application and show you where the conflict begins. Okay, so we have enter first name here, enter last name here. No problem. Whoops. Except I need to spell my name correctly. And I'm going to click the button. Now notice what happened. Instead of getting Bob Tabor here in the label, I get enter first name here, enter last name here. Why did that happen? Well, the reason is actually not very obvious to the untrained eye, but let me explain why I didn't get the results that I expected. Basically, the reason this conflict happens is because we were initializing the values for our text box each time the form loads. So every time even a postback happens, we are going to reset the values of our text box 1 and text box 2 to the values that we have entered here. And since the page load fires first, it overwrites the new values that the end user typed in. So after the page load event fires, then the button 1 click event fires. But at that point, we've already changed the values, overwritten the values that the user typed into text box 1 and text box 2. So how do we fix that? Well, we just need to add a little bit more code. The initial time our page is loaded, that is postback property of the page object, and the page object is something that's just inherited by virtue of the fact that we have an ASP.NET web page. We get a bunch of properties and methods, and again I'm going to refer you to the 3000 series to explain more about these types of objects that are available to you while you're writing your ASP.NET application. But basically this page object is going to know whether or not this page has been requested for the first time, or whether this is simply a postback. In other words, whenever the page just needs to refresh itself. So the initial time our page is loaded, the isPostback is set by the ASP.NET Runtime Engine to be false. But each time we click a button that triggers a postback event, like the button in this example, then the isPostback property will be true, which means that we'll ignore this section of code right here. So we can initialize the values on the page in this section of code, but each time a postback occurs, the web page will maintain its state, meaning that the values will automatically be maintained even though the page is refreshed from the web server. Maintaining state on web pages was very difficult to do before ASP.NET. ASP.NET helps manage state very easily, in fact, automatically in most cases. So now let's run this application again. And we get the results that we were expecting. Now let's have a little more fun with our application. What I want to be able to do is post back, not on a button click, but whenever somebody changes a value within this text box. So what I'll do is just double click this text box, and I'll have the text changed event available to me. So I'm going to go label1.text equals text changed. So now whenever anybody changes the text, we'll be able to say, hey, somebody changed the text, so it should post back and this should work, right? Well, let's go ahead and see what happens. Now when I move my mouse cursor out of this text box, we should fire the event. But nothing happened this time. We didn't get our label with the words text changed. What happened? Well, the reason is because some controls, by their very nature, will trigger a postback event. However, other controls need to be prompted to trigger a postback event, and a text box is one of those. So we need to change a property of the text box to tell it that it's okay that whenever somebody changes text in this text box, then we can trigger a postback. So let's go ahead and find the property called AutoPostback, which by default is set to false. We're going to set that to true, save our application, and run it again. So now this time, whenever I click, I enter Bob, and then I click off of that text box and change the focus to another control. Notice that we did a quick postback, and that now our label says text changed. So I want to re-emphasize the benefit of ASP.NET's ability to maintain the state of a web page. How did this work? How did it know to maintain certain values that I were to type in? Let me run this again. And let's just use one of the text boxes that were not even affected by this postback. So I'll do last name first, and then I'll type in my first name, and then I'll just move the focus back to last name. Now, how did it know to keep the word Tabor here? Why didn't it clear it out? Why did it even save it? How did it know to do that? Well, this has to do with the internals of how ASP.NET manages its state. And to really learn more about this, what I'm going to do is go to my web browser, select View Source, which will allow me to look at the actual source code for that web page. And what I want to call your attention to is one of the values here in the body. It's an input of type hidden, which means it won't be displayed on the web page. The name of the property is called, or the control is called viewState. And now you can see here, I'll do this. I'll word wrap it so you can see the whole thing here in one view. The value equals this big, long, ugly string of numbers and letters. Those values represent the values that are actually in the controls on the form. Now, the values are encoded, so only the ASP.NET engine can interpret them, and that's in order to protect your application from the possibility of a security breach. So somebody doesn't try to crack an open browser and understand what's going on behind the scene. And this is a fairly small view state. If you have 10 or 20 controls on your web page that each have some preset values and properties, in order to get that page back to its original look and feel after a postback occurs, we may have to have dozens of lines in this view state, which can make your web page actually very large. So there is a trade-off to this. But let's talk about the sequence of events, run down what happens whenever the text change event is fired. First of all, whenever we changed something here and then moved out, we trigger a postback, and the ASP.NET runtime engine breaks down all the values that have been submitted, both in the text boxes here, in the label control, in the button, and in the view state. And it sends all those values to various objects that your web page's code can use. And it loads up your web page and begins to execute the form load, and then it executes the event that triggered the postback. In this case, it was the text changed event for that particular text box. And once it considers all the code that needs to be run, and it gathers up all the submitted values and all the changes to the controls that are viewable on the web page, it reassembles the view state, and then it sends the entire page, including the new view state and any new values that need to be overwritten on top of the old values. For example, the label control and how it changed, sends all those back in the form of an HTML page to your web browser. Now, from a practical perspective, all you really need to know at this point is that it just works. But behind the scenes, that's what's going on. There's a lot of plumbing work to make all this happen. So this is literally the tip of the iceberg when it comes to ASP.NET applications. There's a lot of concepts I didn't demonstrate in this video. I didn't demonstrate the use of the session and the application objects, the request and response objects, objects that allow you to review and manipulate query string and cookies. You may not even be familiar with these terms, so I really recommend that you take a look at the 3000 series on LearnVisualStudio.net to learn a lot more about how ASP.NET works and how you can create more robust ASP.NET applications. Also, be sure to get your hands dirty and work on the exercise for Lesson 22, which will instruct you to build a simple ASP.NET calculator. So, I wish you good luck and thank you.